There's a moment when you realize that the person who's supposed to love you unconditionally sees your love as a burden, when the very things that make you care deeply become weapons they use against you, when asking for basic connection gets labeled as needy, and suddenly you're walking on eggshells in your own relationship, apologizing for wanting what every human being deserves. This is about that moment and what comes after when a man decides he's done shrinking himself to fit into someone else's definition of acceptable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Chen had always been the type of man who loved completely. Not desperately, not obsessively, but with the kind of steady devotion that showed up in small gestures. Fresh coffee waiting when she woke up, remembering that she preferred her car warmed up on cold mornings, texting during lunch breaks just to see how her day was going. At 35, he'd built a successful career as a software engineer at a mid-sized tech company in Portland, Oregon, but his real pride came from being a partner who paid attention. His apartment reflected the same methodical care he brought to everything. A corner unit on the fourth floor of a converted warehouse in the Pearl District, with exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the morning light just right. Everything had its place. The kitchen counter was always clean. Bills were paid on time. The small balcony herb garden was meticulously maintained, producing fresh basil and rosemary that he'd use when cooking dinner for two. He'd met Sarah Winters at a coffee shop on a rainy Thursday morning in March. She was hunched over a laptop at a corner table, surrounded by textbooks and highlighters, completely absorbed in whatever she was studying. Her dark hair kept falling into her face as she read, and she had this unconscious habit of tucking it behind her ear every few minutes. Marcus had been waiting for his usual order when he noticed her coffee cup was empty, and she seemed too focused to realize it. He'd approached carefully, not wanting to interrupt. "Excuse me, I noticed your cup's empty. Can I get you a refill? You look like you're in the zone, and I didn't want to break your concentration." She looked up with surprised green eyes, and when she smiled, something in his chest had shifted. Not the dramatic, movie moment kind of shift, but something quieter, like recognition. Sarah was 28, working on her master's degree in environmental science while teaching part-time at a local community college. She had opinions about everything, from the best hiking trails in the Cascades to why pineapple absolutely belonged on pizza. She laughed easily and often, particularly at Marcus's dry observations about his coworkers or the quirks of living in a city where people took their coffee more seriously than their politics. Their first date had been a disaster that somehow became perfect. Marcus had planned a nice dinner at a restaurant downtown, but a kitchen fire had shut the place down just as they arrived. Instead of calling it a night, Sarah had suggested they grab food from a taco truck and eat it sitting on a bench by the Willamette River. They'd talked until midnight, watching the city lights reflect on the water, sharing stories about their families and their dreams and the books that had shaped them. The relationship had developed naturally over the following months. Sarah would study at his apartment while he worked on side projects. They'd discovered they both loved cooking together, though Sarah was more adventurous with spices while Marcus preferred precise measurements and following recipes. Weekends meant exploring the farmer's market, hiking trails just outside the city, or simply staying in to read books in comfortable silence. Marcus had always been attentive to the people he cared about. It wasn't calculated or performative, it was simply how he was wired. He remembered that Sarah preferred Earl Grey tea in the afternoons, that she got stressed about deadlines and needed reassurance, that she felt more confident after a good morning run. When she mentioned being nervous about a presentation, he'd leave an encouraging note in her backpack. When she had a rough day with difficult students, he'd pick up ingredients for her favorite Thai curry. He thought this was what love looked like: showing up, paying attention, making someone's life a little easier, a little brighter, because their happiness mattered to you. His parents had modeled this kind of partnership throughout their 30-year marriage. His father still brought his mother flowers from their garden every Friday. His mother still packed extra food when his father worked late shifts at the hospital. Love was a series of small acts, repeated consistently over time. But somewhere around their 8th month together, Sarah began to pull back in ways that were subtle at first. She'd spend more time studying at the library instead of his apartment. When he'd text during the day, her responses became shorter, less engaged. The easy physical affection they'd shared began to feel more obligatory on her part, like she was going through the motions rather than responding to genuine desire. Marcus noticed because he noticed everything about her. The way she'd check her phone immediately after they hugged, as if she was marking time. How she'd tense slightly when he'd reach for her hand while they watched movies. The barely perceptible pause before she'd say, "I love you too," when he said it first. These weren't dramatic changes, just small shifts in temperature that accumulated over weeks. He tried addressing it directly, asking if everything was okay, if school was stressing her out, if there was anything he could do to help. Sarah would always smile and say she was fine, just busy with her thesis research. She'd kiss his cheek and change the subject, leaving Marcus with the unsettling feeling that he was seeing problems where none existed. Maybe he was overthinking. Maybe this was just what relationships looked like after the initial honeymoon period. The criticism started small and seemingly reasonable. Sarah mentioned that he texted too much during the day, that she needed to focus on her studies without constant interruptions. Marcus immediately scaled back, limiting himself to 1 or 2 messages and only if they were important. Then she said his weekend plans were too structured, that she felt pressure to always have something scheduled together. He began asking what she wanted to do instead of suggesting activities, giving her more control over their time. Each adjustment felt logical in isolation. Of course she needed space to focus on her degree. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Of course she wanted input on how they spent their weekends. Marcus was a problem solver by nature and training. When presented with issues, he worked to fix them. But the fixes never seemed to stick. There was always another way he was being too much, wanting too much, expecting too much. The morning that changed everything was a Tuesday in November. Marcus had woken up early and made coffee for both of them, as was his routine. Sarah came into the kitchen wearing one of his old college sweatshirts, her hair still messy from sleep. She looked beautiful in that unconscious way that had first caught his attention, and without thinking, he'd said, "Good morning, gorgeous. Sleep okay?" Instead of smiling, Sarah had sighed. Actually sighed, like his simple greeting was an imposition. She'd taken the coffee mug without making eye contact and said, "Marcus, we need to talk." The words every relationship fears, delivered while standing in his own kitchen holding coffee he'd made for her. Marcus had felt his stomach drop, but he'd kept his voice steady. "Okay, what's on your mind?" Sarah had sat down at the small dining table, wrapping her hands around the mug like she needed its warmth. She'd looked everywhere except at him as she spoke. "I've been thinking about us, about this relationship, and I think we need to make some changes." Marcus had sat across from her, waiting. In his work, he'd learned that when someone was struggling to articulate a problem, the best thing to do was listen completely before responding. Give them space to say everything they needed to say. "You're too needy, Marcus, like constantly. I can't breathe in this relationship. You always want to know how my day was, what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling. You text me all the time, even though I've asked you to give me space. You plan these elaborate dates and get upset when I don't seem excited enough. You want to cook together and watch movies together and be together constantly, and it's suffocating." The words had hit him like cold water. Too needy. Suffocating. For wanting to share his life with the person he loved. For being interested in her thoughts and feelings. For making an effort to create experiences together. "I never want to just exist in the same space without you needing something from me," Sarah had continued, her voice gaining momentum. "A conversation, validation, attention, affection. It's like you're this emotional vampire that needs constant feeding, and I'm exhausted. I need a partner who can be independent, who has his own life, who doesn't make me responsible for his happiness." Marcus had sat there absorbing the accusation, trying to understand how the things he thought were expressions of love had become evidence of deficiency, how caring about her day had become neediness. How wanting to spend time together had become suffocation. How showing affection had become taking something from her. "I see," he'd said quietly. "So what are you suggesting?" "I think you need to work on yourself. Figure out how to be happy without needing constant validation from me. I love you, but I can't be your whole world. It's not healthy for either of us." The conversation had ended with Sarah leaving for class, kissing him on the forehead like he was a child who'd been gently corrected rather than a partner who'd just been told his love was too much. Marcus had sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the two coffee mugs, trying to process what had just happened. He'd spent a day replaying every interaction they'd had over the past few months, re-examining his behavior through this new lens she'd provided. Was he really too needy? Was his attention actually smothering? Had he somehow become the kind of person who required constant validation without realizing it? That evening, when Sarah came home from her study group, Marcus had been reading on the couch. She'd seemed surprised that he didn't immediately ask about her day or suggest they make dinner together. Instead, he'd looked up, smiled, and said, "Hey, how was your evening?" When she'd given a brief answer, he'd simply nodded and returned to his book. Over the following weeks, Marcus had consciously modified his behavior. He'd stopped texting during the day unless it was logistically necessary. He'd made his own plans for evenings when Sarah was studying. He'd stopped cooking dinner for both of them unless she specifically asked. He'd given her the space she said she needed, the independence she claimed to want. But instead of improving their relationship, the distance had seemed to make Sarah more critical, not less. Now she complained that he was too distant, that he didn't seem interested in her life anymore. When he'd pointed out that he was giving her the space she'd requested, she'd accused him of being passive-aggressive, of punishing her for being honest about her needs. Marcus had found himself in an impossible position. Too attentive meant he was needy and suffocating. Too distant meant he was cold and punishing. There seemed to be no acceptable middle ground, no version of himself that would satisfy her changing definitions of what a partner should be. The realization that had begun to form in the back of his mind was both liberating and devastating. Maybe the problem wasn't that he was too needy. Maybe the problem was that Sarah didn't actually want to be in a relationship at all, at least not with someone who expected it to involve genuine intimacy and connection. Maybe what she wanted was a companion who required nothing from her while providing everything she needed when she needed it. The thought had made him feel simultaneously angry and sad. Angry because he'd spent months trying to modify himself to fit her complaints, shrinking parts of his personality to accommodate her discomfort with genuine connection. Sad because he genuinely loved this woman, had seen a future with her, had been willing to work on any real problems between them. But this wasn't a real problem to be solved. This was a fundamental incompatibility dressed up as a character flaw on his part. Sarah wanted the benefits of a relationship without the emotional investment it required. She wanted someone to cook for her and plan dates and be available when she needed support, but she didn't want to reciprocate the emotional attention those gestures represented. As winter had deepened into January, Marcus had begun to see their dynamic more clearly. He wasn't too needy, he was just needy to someone who had no interest in meeting those needs. He wasn't suffocating, he was just trying to build intimacy with someone who preferred distance. He wasn't requiring too much validation, he was simply expecting the basic reciprocity that healthy relationships required. The final catalyst had come on a Friday evening in February. Sarah had been stressed about her thesis defense, which was still months away but already consuming her thoughts. Marcus had noticed her anxiety and had suggested they take a walk together, maybe grab dinner somewhere quiet where she could decompress and talk through her concerns if she wanted to. Sarah's response had been swift and sharp. "See, this is exactly what I mean. I mention I'm stressed, and immediately you want to fix it, to make it about us spending time together. Can't I just be stressed without you turning it into an opportunity for connection? Sometimes I need to process things alone, Marcus. Not everything is about you." The accusation had been so unfair, so deliberately mischaracterizing his motivations, that something inside Marcus had finally shifted. He wasn't trying to make her stress about him. He was offering support because that's what people do for the ones they love. But in Sarah's worldview, any gesture of care was actually an act of selfishness. Any attempt at connection was actually an invasion of her autonomy. That night, lying in bed next to someone who flinched when he accidentally brushed against her in his sleep, Marcus had made a decision. Not an angry decision or a hurt decision, but a clear one. He was done trying to become smaller to fit into someone else's limited capacity for love. He was done apologizing for wanting the basic components of a healthy relationship. He was done accepting criticism for qualities that any reasonable person would consider strengths. He was going to learn to be completely self-sufficient, not because he was actually too needy, but because he deserved better than someone who saw his love as a burden. And if Sarah wanted independence so badly, he was going to give her more of it than she'd ever imagined possible. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Marcus understood that real change required methodical planning, the same systematic approach he brought to debugging complex code. On Saturday morning, while Sarah slept in, he sat at his desk with a notebook and began mapping out what complete self-sufficiency would actually look like. First, he needed to audit his current dependencies. How many times a week did he seek Sarah's opinion on decisions? How often did he share daily experiences expecting her engagement? How frequently did he initiate physical affection or emotional conversations? The honest inventory was sobering. Without realizing it, he'd woven her approval and participation into nearly every aspect of his routine. Marcus started with the smallest changes. Instead of asking Sarah what she wanted for breakfast on Sunday mornings, he simply made what he felt like eating. When she emerged from the bedroom and saw him eating scrambled eggs with herbs from his balcony garden, she'd paused expectantly. In the past, he would have immediately offered to make her something or asked if she wanted to share. Instead, he'd looked up briefly, said good morning, and continued eating while reading the news on his tablet. The shift in her expression had been immediate and telling. Confusion, then something that might have been disappointment. She'd made her own toast in silence. And Marcus had realized something important. Sarah's complaints about his neediness weren't really about giving her space. They were about maintaining control over when and how connection happened. She wanted him available when she desired attention, but absent when she didn't. At work on Monday, Marcus began implementing professional boundaries he'd never needed before. His colleague Jamie Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, had always been someone Marcus grabbed lunch with regularly. They'd discuss project challenges, share frustrations about management decisions, and generally maintain the kind of collegial friendship that made long days more bearable. But Marcus realized he'd been using Jamie as an emotional outlet for relationship frustrations, seeking validation for his confusion about Sarah's mixed signals. That ended immediately. When Jamie asked how things were going with his girlfriend, Marcus gave a brief, neutral response and redirected the conversation to work topics. When lunch invitations came, Marcus politely declined half of them, choosing instead to take solitary walks around the downtown area. The walking became meditative. Portland's grid system made it easy to explore different neighborhoods without getting lost. Marcus discovered small bookstores he'd never noticed, coffee roasters that weren't part of the major chains, food carts serving cuisines he'd never tried. He wasn't avoiding social interaction out of antisocial impulses, but rather learning to enjoy his own company without needing it validated by others. Evenings presented the biggest challenge. Marcus had always been someone who wanted to decompress by sharing the day's experiences with Sarah. Work victories, minor frustrations, interesting conversations, amusing observations about commuting or coworkers. Now he began processing these experiences internally instead, writing them down in a journal or simply reflecting on them during his evening routine. Sarah noticed the change within a week. On Thursday evening, she'd settled onto the couch next to him with clear expectation they'd discuss their respective days. Marcus had been reading a biography of a software pioneer, genuinely absorbed in the subject matter. When Sarah made a comment about her thesis advisor being unreasonable, Marcus had looked up, made an appropriate sympathetic sound, and returned to his book. The silence that followed was thick with her confusion. In the past, Marcus would have put the book down immediately, given her his full attention, asked follow-up questions, and probably offered to make tea while she vented about academic politics. Instead, he'd simply acknowledged her frustration and continued reading. "That's it?" Sarah had asked. "You're not going to ask what happened?" Marcus had looked up again, genuinely surprised by the question. "Do you want to tell me what happened? I thought you'd be interested." "I am, if you want to share. But you've mentioned that I ask too many questions about your day, so I'm giving you space to bring up what you want to discuss." The conversation had ended there, but Marcus could feel Sarah's puzzlement radiating from her side of the couch. She'd expected him to pursue her statement, to coax details from her, to provide the emotional labor of drawing her out. When he hadn't, she'd seemed almost deflated. The pattern repeated over the following weeks. Sarah would make oblique references to problems or stress, clearly expecting Marcus to inquire further and provide support. When he didn't take the bait, responding only to direct requests for help or advice, she'd become increasingly frustrated. But she couldn't complain about it without contradicting her previous criticisms about his neediness. Marcus wasn't being deliberately withholding or passive-aggressive. He was simply learning to interact like an emotionally self-sufficient person. If Sarah wanted to discuss something, she could bring it up directly. If she wanted his opinion on something, she could ask for it. If she wanted his help with something, she could request it. But he was done being responsible for anticipating and meeting emotional needs she claimed not to want him to address. The physical changes were equally deliberate. Marcus had always been tactilely affectionate, not in an excessive way, but in the casual manner of someone comfortable with physical intimacy. Hand-holding during movies, brief touches while passing in the kitchen, spontaneous hugs when one of them was leaving for work. Sarah's complaints about feeling suffocated had made him question whether these gestures were unwelcome, so he stopped initiating them entirely. Again, Sarah's reaction revealed the contradictory nature of her complaints. Within 2 weeks, she was commenting on how distant he seemed, how they rarely touched anymore except during sex, and even that had become perfunctory. When Marcus pointed out that he was respecting her stated need for physical space, she'd accused him of taking her words too literally, of being unable to understand nuance. But Marcus was beginning to understand the real dynamic perfectly. Sarah wanted the security of knowing his affection was available while maintaining the power to reject it when she chose. She wanted him to keep offering so she could keep declining, proving to herself that she was desired with never having to fully reciprocate that desire. It was an emotionally manipulative pattern disguised as having boundaries. The social changes were perhaps the most liberating. Marcus had gradually allowed their social life to revolve around Sarah's preferences and comfort levels. She preferred small gatherings to large parties, quiet restaurants to busy ones, staying in to going out. While these weren't unreasonable preferences, Marcus realized he'd completely stopped expressing his own social desires to accommodate hers. He began making plans independently. When his college friend David invited him to a basketball game, Marcus accepted without checking with Sarah first. When his coworker mentioned a hiking group that met on Saturday mornings, Marcus joined them. When he saw a lecture at Powell's Books about sustainable architecture, something that interested him professionally, he bought a ticket for himself alone. Sarah's response to his increased independence was telling. She didn't object to the activities themselves, but she seemed unsettled by not being consulted about his schedule. She'd ask what time he'd be home from the hiking group with an edge of anxiety in her voice. She'd wonder aloud why he hadn't invited her to the lecture, despite having shown no previous interest in his professional development. Most revealing was her reaction when Marcus began cooking for one. He'd always prepared meals for both of them, asking about her preferences, accommodating her dietary restrictions, planning menus around her schedule. Now he cooked what he wanted to eat when he wanted to eat it. If Sarah wanted something different, she was welcome to prepare it herself or suggest they cook together. But he stopped being the default household chef. The first time Sarah came home to find Marcus eating dinner alone, having not prepared anything for her, she'd stood in the kitchen doorway looking genuinely shocked. "You didn't make enough for me?" Marcus had looked up from his plate of pasta with homemade pesto, made from the basil he'd been growing on the balcony. "I didn't know when you'd be home or if you'd want dinner. There's leftover sauce in the fridge if you want to make some pasta." "But you always make dinner for both of us." "You said I was too focused on doing things together. I'm giving you the independence to handle your own meals." Sarah had stood there for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to respond. She couldn't argue that he should go back to assuming responsibility for her dinner without contradicting her previous complaints about his excessive attention. But she clearly hadn't expected him to take her criticisms so literally. The shift in household dynamics accelerated from there. Marcus stopped doing Sarah's laundry along with his own. He stopped picking up groceries for her when he went shopping. He stopped tidying shared spaces beyond his own messes. These weren't acts of spite or retaliation, but logical extensions of becoming self-sufficient. If Sarah wanted independence from his attention and care, that independence had to be complete. The most significant change was in his emotional availability. Marcus had always been someone Sarah could vent to about work stress, family drama, and academic pressures. He'd listened actively, offered perspective when asked, and provided the kind of supportive presence that helps people process difficult experiences. But being emotionally available to someone who saw that availability as neediness felt increasingly absurd. When Sarah came home upset about a conflict with her thesis advisor, Marcus acknowledged her frustration but didn't pursue the conversation. When she mentioned financial stress about student loans, he offered practical suggestions if asked, but didn't volunteer to help brainstorm solutions. When she had anxiety about her upcoming defense, he expressed confidence in her abilities, but didn't offer to help her practice or provide extra emotional support. Each of these changes represented Marcus learning to distinguish between being a supportive partner and being an emotional caretaker. A supportive partner responds to direct requests for help and comfort. An emotional caretaker anticipates needs, pursues problems that haven't been shared, and takes responsibility for another person's emotional well-being. Sarah had trained him to be the latter while complaining about the burden it created. The transformation wasn't without internal challenges. Marcus had to resist his natural inclination to offer comfort when Sarah seemed stressed, to ask follow-up questions when she mentioned problems, to anticipate her needs and meet them before being asked. These impulses weren't character flaws, they were expressions of care and attentiveness. But in the context of this relationship, they'd been reframed as problems to be solved. Marcus found himself questioning fundamental assumptions about what relationships should involve. Was it really neediness to want to share daily experiences with your partner? Was it actually suffocating to show physical affection regularly? Was offering emotional support truly a form of taking rather than giving? The more he examined these questions, the more convinced he became that Sarah's complaints weren't about his behavior, but about her discomfort with intimacy itself. 3 months into his self-sufficiency project, Marcus was living like a single person who happened to share living space with someone he occasionally slept with. He had his own routines, his own social activities, his own emotional processing methods, and his own household responsibilities. Sarah had gotten exactly what she'd claimed to want, a partner who required nothing from her. The irony was that the less Marcus needed from Sarah, the more she seemed to need from him. She began initiating conversations about his day when he stopped sharing unprompted updates. She started suggesting activities together when he stopped planning their weekends. She increased her physical affection when he stopped being casually tactile. It was as if his emotional unavailability had made him more attractive to her, confirming his growing suspicion that she was more interested in the chase than the catch. But Marcus wasn't playing hard to get or trying to manipulate her interest. He was genuinely becoming someone who didn't need her validation, approval, or companionship to feel complete. The process had revealed how much of his identity had been unconsciously wrapped up in being needed by someone else. Learning to meet his own emotional needs was like developing a muscle he'd never properly exercised. The breaking point came on a Friday evening in late April. Sarah had clearly planned to spend the evening together, perhaps expecting they'd cook dinner, watch something on streaming, and enjoy the kind of low-key date night they used to have regularly. Instead, she'd come home to find Marcus preparing to leave for a dinner with his hiking group, something he'd mentioned in passing earlier in the week. "Wait, you're going out tonight?" Sarah had asked, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. Yeah, I mentioned Tom was organizing a group dinner at that new place on Hawthorne. Should be fun. But it's Friday night. Marcus had paused in putting on his jacket, genuinely confused by her tone. Yes, it is Friday night. We always spend Friday nights together. We used to, when you seemed to enjoy it, but you've made it clear that you prefer having space to do your own thing. I assumed you'd appreciate having the apartment to yourself tonight. Sarah had stared at him with an expression that seemed to combine hurt, anger, and something that might have been panic. So now you just make plans without considering me at all? I told you about it on Tuesday. You didn't express any interest in coming along, and you didn't mention wanting to do anything together tonight. I shouldn't have to ask you to prioritize our relationship. The statement had hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of its contradiction. For months, Sarah had criticized Marcus for prioritizing their relationship too much, for being too focused on togetherness, for not being independent enough. Now she was upset that he'd taken her feedback to heart. Marcus had looked at his girlfriend, this woman he'd spent nearly 2 years trying to love in exactly the way she claimed to want, and felt a profound sense of clarity. She didn't actually know what she wanted from a relationship, or perhaps she wanted contradictory things that no single person could provide. She wanted him to be available but not needy, caring but not suffocating, attentive but not intrusive, independent but not distant. "Sarah," he'd said quietly, "I need you to help me understand something. For months, you've told me I'm too needy, that I suffocate you, that I require too much attention and validation. I've worked hard to become more self-sufficient, to give you the space you said you needed, to stop being so dependent on your time and energy. Now you're upset that I'm not prioritizing togetherness enough. What exactly do you want from me?" Sarah's response had been to deflect rather than answer. "I want you to care about our relationship. I want you to want to spend time with me. I want you to act like my boyfriend, not like some roommate who occasionally sleeps in my bed. But when I acted like your boyfriend before, you said I was being too much. When I showed that I wanted to spend time with you, you said I was suffocating. When I cared about our relationship by asking about your day and planning activities for us, you said I was needy and exhausting." The conversation had continued in circles, with Sarah unable to articulate a coherent vision of what she actually wanted. And Marcus increasingly convinced that the problem wasn't his behavior, but her fundamental ambivalence about being in a committed relationship. She wanted the benefits of having a devoted partner without the reciprocal obligations that devotion required. Marcus had gone to dinner with his hiking group that night, and the contrast had been stark. These were people who enjoyed each other's company without keeping score of who was giving more attention or requiring more emotional energy. Conversations flowed naturally, without anyone being accused of being too interested in others' experiences. People offered support and encouragement without being labeled as needy or suffocating. It was what healthy social interaction looked like when not filtered through someone else's discomfort with genuine connection. When he'd returned home that night, Sarah had been waiting up for him, something she rarely did anymore. She'd clearly spent the evening thinking about their earlier conversation, and her approach had been different, softer, more vulnerable. "I think I owe you an apology," she'd said as Marcus hung up his jacket. "I've been giving you mixed signals, and that's not fair." Marcus had sat down across from her, waiting to hear what she'd realized during his absence. "I think I've been scared," Sarah had continued. "My last relationship was with someone who was really controlling, who used his emotions to manipulate me into doing what he wanted. When you're so attentive and caring, sometimes it triggers that fear, even though I know logically that you're nothing like him." It was the first time Sarah had mentioned her previous relationship in any detail, and Marcus had felt a surge of understanding. If she'd been with someone who weaponized emotional intimacy, it would make sense that genuine expressions of love might feel threatening. But understanding the origin of someone's behavior didn't make that behavior acceptable indefinitely. "I appreciate you sharing that," Marcus had said carefully, "and I understand how past experiences can affect current relationships. But Sarah, I can't keep adjusting my behavior based on fears about someone else's actions. I'm not your ex-boyfriend. I've never tried to control or manipulate you. And if my natural way of showing love feels threatening to you, then maybe we're not compatible. The conversation that followed had been the most honest they'd had in months. Sarah admitted that she'd been testing him, pushing him away to see if he'd fight for her attention. She'd expected him to pursue her when she created distance, to prove that he cared by refusing to accept her boundaries. When he'd respected her stated needs instead of fighting them, she'd interpreted it as him caring less rather than him respecting her more. It was a revelation that explained everything and solved nothing. Sarah had been unconsciously recreating the dynamic from her previous relationship, where love was proven through persistence in the face of rejection. She'd been looking for Marcus to chase her, to refuse to accept her criticism, to demonstrate his devotion by ignoring her stated preferences. The healthier he'd become, the more convinced she'd become that he was losing interest. Marcus had tried to explain the difference between neediness and normal relationship expectations, between suffocation and reasonable intimacy, between manipulation and genuine care. But the conversation had revealed a fundamental incompatibility that no amount of communication could bridge. Sarah needed to work through her fears about emotional intimacy before she could be in a healthy relationship with anyone. Marcus couldn't keep shrinking himself to accommodate someone else's unresolved trauma. The relationship had limped along for another month after that conversation, with both of them trying to pretend they could make it work. But Marcus had crossed a line in his personal development that made it impossible to go backward. He'd learned to be genuinely self-sufficient, to meet his own emotional needs, to find fulfillment in his own company and interests. The version of himself that had needed Sarah's validation and approval to feel whole had been replaced by someone who could offer love freely without requiring it to be reciprocated in specific ways. Sarah, meanwhile, seemed to struggle with his newfound emotional independence. She'd alternate between appreciating the space he gave her and resenting the fact that he no longer pursued her when she pulled away. She wanted him to need her without having to meet those needs, to depend on her without her having to be dependable in return. It was an untenable dynamic that left both of them frustrated and unfulfilled. The end, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. Marcus had been preparing for a solo camping trip to the Oregon coast, something he'd always wanted to do but had never suggested because Sarah wasn't interested in outdoor activities. As he'd packed his gear, she'd watched with an expression that seemed to combine sadness and resignation. "You don't need me at all anymore, do you?" she asked quietly. Marcus had stopped packing and looked at her directly. "I don't need you to validate my decisions or manage my emotions or be responsible for my happiness. If that's what you mean by needing you, then no, I don't need you anymore." "But you don't want me either." "I want to be with someone who wants to be with me. I want to love someone who sees that love as a gift rather than a burden. I want to build something with someone who's excited about building it together. If you can't be that person, then what we're doing isn't really a relationship." Sarah had nodded slowly, and Marcus had seen something like relief in her expression. The conversation they'd both been avoiding was finally happening, and neither of them had to pretend anymore that they could make it work through effort alone. They'd spent that evening talking more honestly than they had in months. They cared about each other, but they weren't compatible as romantic partners. Sarah needed someone who would chase her, who would fight for her attention, who would prove their love by refusing to respect her boundaries. Marcus needed someone who appreciated care and attention, who wanted to build genuine intimacy, who saw emotional availability as a strength rather than a weakness. The breakup had been sad but not devastating. They'd both grown during their time together, just in directions that made them less compatible rather than more. Sarah had learned to identify her patterns around emotional intimacy, and Marcus had learned to be complete without needing someone else to fill gaps in his self-worth. Most importantly, Marcus had learned that being called needy by someone who couldn't handle genuine connection wasn't actually an indictment of his character. Some people were uncomfortable with emotional intimacy and would label any attempt at deep connection as too much. That was information about them, not about him. Marcus moved out of the shared apartment on a crisp Saturday morning in June. The process was remarkably simple, considering they'd lived together for over a year. Most of the furniture had been his anyway, purchased before Sarah moved in or acquired specifically for the larger space they'd shared. The books, kitchen equipment, and electronics that mattered to him fit into his Honda Accord with room to spare. What surprised him most was how little he actually needed to feel at home. The new place was a studio apartment in the Beaumont, Wilshire neighborhood, smaller than what he'd shared with Sarah, but perfectly sized for one person who'd learned not to accumulate things for the sake of filling space. The building was older, with hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot and large windows that caught the afternoon light. The kitchen was compact but functional, with enough counter space for serious cooking and a small table that could serve as both dining area and workspace. Moving day itself had been surprisingly peaceful. Sarah had made herself scarce, ostensibly visiting her sister in Vancouver, though Marcus suspected she simply couldn't handle the emotional weight of watching him pack up their shared life. They'd divided their possessions without drama or argument, both of them seeming eager to complete the separation cleanly. The few items they'd purchased together, Marcus had left behind without discussion. Starting fresh felt more important than claiming ownership of shared memories. The first night in his new place, Marcus had sat on his single chair at a small table, eating takeout Thai food and looking around at the space that was entirely his. No compromises on wall color or furniture placement. No need to consider someone else's preferences for lighting or temperature. No tension about how much space his hobbies could occupy, or whether his morning routine was too noisy. The silence wasn't lonely, it was liberating. Sleep came easily that first night and every night after. Marcus hadn't realized how much energy he'd been expending trying to read Sarah's moods and adjust his behavior accordingly. Without that constant low-level stress, his mind could actually rest. He woke up refreshed for the first time in months, eager to start days that belonged entirely to him. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that felt natural rather than imposed. Marcus would wake at 6:30, make coffee using beans from a local roaster he discovered during his lunch walks, and spend 30 minutes reading before getting ready for work. The commute to his office was actually shorter from the new apartment, and he used the extra time to stop at a bagel shop that had become part of his morning routine. The owner, an older Iranian man named Fareed, had begun greeting him by name and remembering his usual order. These small interactions felt more genuine than many of the conversations he'd had with Sarah toward the end of their relationship. Work had taken on new dimensions as well. Without the emotional drain of managing relationship dynamics, Marcus found himself more focused and creative. He volunteered for a challenging project involving machine learning applications for environmental monitoring, something that combined his technical skills with his growing interest in sustainability. The project required collaboration with researchers at Portland State University, giving him exposure to academic perspectives he'd never encountered in corporate settings. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the lead researcher on the environmental monitoring project, was the kind of person Marcus had always admired but rarely encountered in his social circles. She was brilliant without being arrogant, passionate about her work without being obsessive, and collaborative without being needy. Their professional relationship was based on mutual respect and shared goals, rather than the complex emotional negotiations he'd grown accustomed to in personal relationships. Working with Elena's team reminded Marcus what healthy professional relationships looked like. People communicated directly about their needs and constraints. Conflicts were addressed as problems to be solved rather than personal attacks to be defended against. Support was offered freely without expectation of specific reciprocity. It was a stark contrast to the emotional accounting that had characterized his relationship with Sarah. The project meetings were held on the university campus, and Marcus began arriving early to walk around the grounds before heading to the engineering building. The campus in late spring was beautiful, with old-growth trees creating natural canopies over pathways where students and faculty moved with purpose. He'd forgotten how energizing it could be to be around people who were passionate about learning and discovery, rather than focused on emotional drama and interpersonal manipulation. One afternoon, after a particularly productive meeting about sensor calibration techniques, Elena had suggested the team grab coffee together to continue discussing some technical challenges they'd identified. Marcus had hesitated for a moment, his default response still shaped by months of walking on eggshells around social invitations. But then he'd realized there was no reason to hesitate. He wasn't checking anyone else's schedule or mood or energy level. He could simply decide based on his own interest and availability. The conversation over coffee had been exactly what Marcus had been missing without realizing it. Technical challenges discussed with genuine enthusiasm. Professional experiences shared without ulterior motives. Ideas built upon collaboratively without anyone keeping score of who contributed what. Elena mentioned that she'd been working on similar projects in Costa Rica and described the challenges of deploying sensor networks in rainforest environments. Her graduate student, James, shared insights from his previous work in the automotive industry. Marcus found himself contributing perspectives from his corporate experience that seemed to genuinely interest and inform the group. When Elena mentioned that the team sometimes grabbed dinner together after long project days, Marcus had accepted the invitation without the complicated internal calculations that had become his default mode. No worrying about whether his participation would be seen as too eager or not enthusiastic enough. No concern about whether his presence would impose obligations on others or create expectations he couldn't meet. Just a straightforward decision based on whether he wanted to spend time with interesting people discussing work he cared about. These casual dinners became a regular part of Marcus's routine, and he began to remember what social interaction could feel like when it wasn't filtered through someone else's discomfort with genuine connection. The group would gather at different restaurants around the city, comparing notes on recent research, sharing stories from their various backgrounds, and debating everything from optimal programming languages to the ethics of environmental monitoring technologies. Marcus realized he'd been socially isolated for months without recognizing it. Sarah's discomfort with his social energy had gradually trained him to minimize connections outside their relationship. He'd stopped accepting invitations from colleagues, declined opportunities to meet new people, and generally narrowed his social world to accommodate her preferences for small, controlled interactions. Breaking free from that constraint felt like removing a weight he'd grown so accustomed to carrying that he'd forgotten it was there. The hiking group he'd joined had also become more central to his routine. What had started as Saturday morning walks through Forest Park had evolved into weekend trips to more challenging trails throughout the Cascade Range. The group was loosely organized around a core of 6 or 7 regular participants, with others joining occasionally based on their schedules and interests. Marcus had never been part of a friend group that formed around shared activities rather than shared history or circumstance, and he was surprised by how quickly genuine friendships could develop when people connected over common interests. Tom Nakamura, the informal leader of the hiking group, worked as a physical therapist and brought a practical understanding of outdoor safety that made the more ambitious trips possible. Lisa Park was a high school biology teacher who knew the local flora and fauna better than any field guide. David Kim ran a small coffee roasting business and always brought perfectly calibrated amounts of caffeine for the group's consumption. These weren't people Marcus would have met through work or dating or family connections, but they'd become genuine friends through the simple process of showing up consistently and sharing experiences. The hiking trips provided something Marcus hadn't realized he'd been missing: physical challenges that required focus and determination, natural beauty that put daily concerns into perspective, group dynamics based on mutual support rather than emotional manipulation. When someone struggled with a difficult section of trail, others offered encouragement and practical help without being asked. When someone needed to rest or adjust their pace, the group accommodated naturally without anyone feeling guilty or defensive. Most importantly, these relationships didn't require Marcus to monitor his level of engagement or worry about being too much or not enough. He could offer help when he saw someone struggling without being accused of being controlling. He could share enthusiasm about a beautiful view without being told he was too intense. He could suggest new trails or activities without being criticized for always needing to plan things. These casual dinners became a regular part of Marcus's routine, and he began to remember what social interaction could feel like when it wasn't filtered through someone else's discomfort with genuine connection. The group would gather at different restaurants around the city, comparing notes on recent research, sharing stories from their various backgrounds, and debating everything from optimal programming languages to the ethics of environmental monitoring technologies. Marcus realized he'd been socially isolated for months without recognizing it. Sarah's discomfort with his social energy had gradually trained him to minimize connections outside their relationship. He'd stopped accepting invitations from colleagues, declined opportunities to meet new people, and generally narrowed his social world to accommodate her preferences for small, controlled interactions. Breaking free from that constraint felt like removing a weight he'd grown so accustomed to carrying that he'd forgotten it was there. The hiking group he'd joined had also become more central to his routine. What had started as Saturday morning walks through Forest Park had evolved into weekend trips to more challenging trails throughout the Cascade Range. The group was loosely organized around a core of 6 or 7 regular participants, with others joining occasionally based on their schedules and interests. Marcus had never been part of a friend group that formed around shared activities rather than shared history or circumstance, and he was surprised by how quickly genuine friendships could develop when people connected over common interests. Tom Nakamura, the informal leader of the hiking group, worked as a physical therapist and brought a practical understanding of outdoor safety that made the more ambitious trips possible. Lisa Park was a high school biology teacher who knew the local flora and fauna better than any field guide. David Kim ran a small coffee roasting business and always brought perfectly calibrated amounts of caffeine for the group's consumption. These weren't people Marcus would have met through work or dating or family connections, but they'd become genuine friends through the simple process of showing up consistently and sharing experiences. The hiking trips provided something Marcus hadn't realized he'd been missing: physical challenges that required focus and determination, natural beauty that put daily concerns into perspective, group dynamics based on mutual support rather than emotional manipulation. When someone struggled with a difficult section of trail, others offered encouragement and practical help without being asked. When someone needed to rest or adjust their pace, the group accommodated naturally without anyone feeling guilty or defensive. Most importantly, these relationships didn't require Marcus to monitor his level of engagement or worry about being too much or not enough. He could offer help when he saw someone struggling without being accused of being controlling. He could share enthusiasm about a beautiful view without being told he was too intense. He could suggest new trails. The contrast with his relationship dynamics with Sarah was stark and instructive. 3 months after the breakup, Marcus received a text from Sarah asking if they could meet for coffee to talk. His immediate reaction was a flash of the old anxiety, the familiar feeling of needing to manage someone else's emotional needs and navigate complex interpersonal dynamics. But that feeling passed quickly, replaced by genuine curiosity about what she wanted to discuss and calm confidence in his ability to handle whatever conversation she had in mind. They met at a neutral location, a coffee shop in the Alberta district that neither of them had frequented during their relationship. Sarah looked good, Marcus noticed, without feeling the complex mix of attraction and resentment that might have characterized such an observation months earlier. She seemed rested and more relaxed than he remembered her being during the final months of their relationship. "You look happy," Sarah said, after they'd exchanged initial pleasantries and found a table by the window. "I am happy," Marcus replied simply. "How are you doing?" Sarah had spent several minutes updating him on her thesis progress, her summer teaching position, and her family news. The conversation felt oddly formal, like they were distant acquaintances catching up, rather than people who'd shared a bed and a lease until recently. But it wasn't uncomfortable, just different from the charged interactions that had characterized their final months together. Eventually, Sarah had gotten to the point of the meeting. "I've been thinking a lot about our relationship, about what went wrong and what I could have done differently. I wanted to apologize for some of the things I said to you, especially about being too needy. I think I was projecting my own issues onto you instead of dealing with them directly." Marcus had appreciated the apology while recognizing that it came too late to change anything meaningful. "I appreciate you saying that. I hope you're working through whatever made intimacy feel threatening to you." "I am. I'm actually seeing a therapist now, trying to understand my patterns better. She's helped me recognize that I was asking you to manage my anxiety about closeness instead of learning to manage it myself." The conversation had continued for another hour, with Sarah sharing insights from her therapy sessions and Marcus offering his own reflections on what he'd learned about himself since their breakup. It was the kind of honest, productive conversation they'd never managed to have while they were together, when the stakes had felt too high and the emotions too raw for genuine communication. What struck Marcus most was how little he felt during this conversation. Not anger or hurt or longing or regret, just mild interest and general goodwill towards someone who'd been important to him but was no longer part of his daily life. The dramatic emotions that had characterized their relationship had been replaced by the calm neutrality of completed experience. When Sarah asked whether he thought they could try again, armed with new insights and better communication skills, Marcus had felt only clarity. I think we're both probably better people than we were 6 months ago, and I'm glad you're working on understanding yourself better. But I don't want to try again. What we had taught me important things about what I need in a relationship, and I don't think we're compatible in those ways." Sarah had seemed disappointed but not surprised by his response. "Are you seeing someone else?" "No, but that's not why I don't want to try again. I'm just not interested in revisiting something that required so much effort to maintain. I want to be with someone who appreciates care and attention, who wants to build intimacy together, who sees emotional connection as a positive thing rather than something to be managed or limited." The conversation had ended with genuine well wishes on both sides. Sarah seemed to understand that Marcus's decision wasn't about anger or punishment, but about knowing what he wanted and being willing to wait for it rather than settle for something that had never quite worked. Marcus left the meeting feeling confirmed in his choices rather than conflicted about them. Summer in Portland unfolded with the kind of perfect weather that made residents forget about the 9 months of rain that justified it. Marcus spent weekend mornings exploring different neighborhoods by bicycle, discovering pockets of the city he'd never seen despite living there for several years. He found used bookstores that specialized in technical subjects, farmers markets that sold vegetables he'd never heard of, food carts that served cuisines he'd never tried. The process of exploration felt metaphorical as well as literal. Without the need to consider someone else's preferences or energy levels, Marcus could pursue interests he'd forgotten he had. He signed up for a pottery class at a community center, something he'd been curious about since college but had never prioritized. The tactile process of working with clay was meditative in a way that programming could never be, requiring presence and attention, but not the kind of analytical thinking that dominated his professional life. His instructor, an older woman named Joan who'd been teaching ceramics for 30 years, had a way of offering guidance that felt supportive rather than critical. When Marcus's early attempts collapsed or cracked, she'd point out what had worked well before suggesting adjustments for next time. The philosophy seemed to be that failure was information rather than judgment, a perspective Marcus found he could apply to other areas of his life as well. The pottery studio attracted an eclectic mix of people, from retirees exploring new hobbies to young professionals seeking creative outlets to artists developing their skills. Marcus enjoyed the conversations that developed naturally around shared struggles with centering clay or glazing techniques. These interactions felt effortless in a way that reminded him how exhausting his relationship with Sarah had become by comparison. One evening in July, while Marcus was working on a bowl that was finally starting to resemble his intentions, Elena from the university project stopped by the studio. She'd mentioned during a team meeting that she was interested in trying pottery, and Joan had suggested she visit during an open studio session to see if she wanted to sign up for classes. "I didn't know you were artistic," Elena said, watching Marcus shape the rim of his bowl with careful attention. "I'm not sure I am artistic, but I like the process," Marcus replied. "There's something satisfying about working with your hands on something that's not digital." Elena had tried working with clay for a few minutes, with Marcus and Joan offering basic guidance about posture and pressure. She'd seemed to enjoy the experience despite her initial awkwardness, and Joan had given her information about beginner classes starting in August. As they'd walked to their cars afterward, Elena had mentioned that the research team was planning a camping trip to Crater Lake in September, combining some field work with a long weekend in one of Oregon's most beautiful locations. "You should come if you're interested. We could use someone with your technical background for the equipment setup, and it's supposed to be an amazing place for hiking and photography." Marcus had accepted the invitation immediately, without the complex internal negotiations that had become his default during the final months with Sarah. No worrying about whether his enthusiasm would be seen as too much or whether his participation would create obligations he couldn't meet. Just a straightforward decision based on his interest in the work and the people involved. The summer continued with this kind of easy expansion of activities and relationships. Marcus joined a recreational volleyball league that met Thursday evenings at a park near his apartment. He started attending lectures at the Central Library on topics ranging from urban planning to sustainable agriculture. He took a weekend workshop on home brewing and began experimenting with small batches of beer using equipment he set up on his apartment balcony. Each new activity brought opportunities to meet people who shared specific interests, creating a social network that felt both broader and more authentic than what he'd had, all trying to accommodate Sarah's preferences for limited, controlled interactions. Marcus wasn't actively trying to expand his social circle, but rather following his genuine interests and allowing connections to develop naturally around shared activities. The difference was profound. Instead of managing one complicated relationship that required constant attention and adjustment, Marcus had multiple simple relationships based on common interests and mutual respect. The hiking group for outdoor adventures, the pottery studio for creative expression, the volleyball league for physical activity and friendly competition, the research team for intellectual challenges and professional growth. Each relationship existed for its own sake rather than as part of a complex emotional system that required careful balance and negotiation. By August, Marcus realized he'd stopped thinking about Sarah entirely for days at a time. Not because he was avoiding memories of their relationship, but because his current life was engaging enough that he didn't have mental energy left over for rehashing past experiences. The contrast was striking. During their relationship, especially toward the end, he'd spent significant amounts of time analyzing their interactions, trying to understand what had gone wrong and how he could fix it. Now, he simply lived his days without needing to analyze or fix anything. The Crater Lake trip in September was everything Marcus had hoped it would be and more. The research component involved testing new sensor configurations in high-altitude alpine environments, work that was technically challenging and practically important for future environmental monitoring projects. But the location was stunning in a way that made even the most focused technical work feel like a privilege. The group had camped for 3 nights at a site near the rim of the caldera, waking each morning to views that seemed too dramatic to be real. Marcus had brought his camera and spent early morning hours capturing images of the lake as light moved across its surface. He wasn't an experienced photographer, but the subject matter was forgiving, and the process of looking carefully at natural beauty felt meditative and satisfying. Elena had proven to be an excellent camping companion, knowledgeable about outdoor skills Marcus had never learned, and willing to teach without making him feel incompetent. She'd shown him how to properly set up a tent in windy conditions, how to purify water from natural sources, and how to identify edible plants growing near their campsite. These weren't romantic interactions, just practical knowledge shared between people who enjoyed learning from each other. On the final evening of the trip, as the group sat around their campfire discussing the successful completion of their fieldwork, Marcus had felt a profound sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with romance or validation from another person. He was surrounded by people he genuinely liked, engaged in work he found meaningful, in a place of extraordinary natural beauty. His happiness didn't depend on anyone else's mood or approval or attention. It was entirely self-generated and self-sustaining. That realization marked a fundamental shift in how Marcus understood himself and what he wanted from life. For most of his adult years, he'd unconsciously organized his happiness around relationships with other people, particularly romantic relationships. His sense of well-being had been tied to how well he was connecting with others, how much he was needed and appreciated, how successfully he was meeting other people's expectations and desires. But the months of forced self-sufficiency had taught him something crucial. He could be genuinely happy living primarily for himself, pursuing his own interests, building friendships based on mutual appreciation rather than mutual need. He could offer care and support to others without requiring it to be reciprocated in specific ways. He could enjoy solitude without feeling lonely and seek company without feeling desperate for it. This didn't make him selfish or antisocial. If anything, he'd become a better friend and colleague because he was interacting with people from a place of genuine interest rather than emotional neediness. He listened more carefully because he wasn't preoccupied with managing his own anxiety about whether he was being heard. He offered help more freely because he wasn't keeping score of who owed what to whom. He participated in group activities more authentically because he wasn't worried about whether his level of enthusiasm was appropriate. October brought the kind of crisp, clear weather that made Portland feel like the most beautiful city in the world. Marcus had settled into routines that felt sustainable and satisfying. Morning coffee and reading before work, challenging projects that used his skills in service of causes he cared about. Evening activities that ranged from solitary cooking experiments to group volleyball games to pottery classes where he was finally producing pieces he was proud of. The hiking group had planned an ambitious trip to the Cascade Range for early November, a 3-day backpacking expedition that would require more preparation and equipment than their usual day hikes. Marcus had invested in proper gear and spent weeks researching the route and weather conditions. The physical challenge appealed to him, but more importantly, he was looking forward to several days of complete disconnection from digital communication and urban concerns. As he'd prepared for the trip, packing carefully and checking equipment multiple times, Marcus had reflected on how different this process felt from the complicated negotiations that any travel plans had required during his relationship with Sarah. No need to consider someone else's comfort level with outdoor activities, or anxiety about being disconnected from communication. No compromise on route selection or duration or group composition. Just his own preferences and capabilities determining his choices. The backpacking trip exceeded his expectations in every way. The physical challenge of carrying everything he needed for 3 days pushed his body in ways he'd forgotten he enjoyed. The group dynamics were supportive and uncomplicated, with everyone contributing to camp setup and meal preparation without needing to negotiate who was responsible for what. The natural beauty of old-growth forests and alpine meadows provided a sense of perspective that made his daily concerns appropriately small. Most importantly, Marcus had discovered that he genuinely enjoyed his own company for extended periods. During long stretches of hiking when conversation wasn't practical, he'd found his mind settling into a kind of meditative rhythm that felt restorative rather than boring. He'd stopped needing constant stimulation or validation or entertainment from external sources. His own thoughts and observations were sufficient company. On the final night of the trip, as the group had gathered around their camp stove sharing freeze-dried meals that somehow tasted better than most restaurant food, Elena had mentioned that she'd been offered a position at a research institute in Colorado. The opportunity was exciting professionally, involving climate change research in mountain ecosystems, but it would mean leaving Portland and the collaborative relationships she'd built with local colleagues. "It's the kind of opportunity I've been working toward for years," she'd said, "but I'm going to miss this group and the projects we've been developing together." Marcus had felt genuinely sad to hear about Elena's potential departure, not because he was romantically interested in her, but because he'd come to value their professional relationship and the broader research community she'd introduced him to. But the sadness was clean and uncomplicated, the natural response to knowing that something good was coming to an end, rather than the complex mixture of abandonment anxiety and resentment that had characterized his reactions to change during his relationship with Sarah. "That's incredible news about the opportunity," Marcus had said. "The work you'll be doing sounds exactly aligned with your interests and expertise. It'll be a loss for the Portland research community, but it sounds like the right move for your career." The conversation had continued, with the group discussing Elena's decision and sharing similar experiences of career transitions that required difficult geographical choices. Marcus had participated naturally in the conversation, offering perspective and support without feeling like he needed to make Elena's decision about himself or their working relationship. Later that night, lying in his sleeping bag and looking up at stars that were invisible from the city, Marcus had reflected on how much his capacity for handling change had evolved. During his relationship with Sarah, any potential disruption to their established patterns had felt threatening and had required extensive discussion and reassurance. Now, he could genuinely celebrate other people's good fortune even when it would negatively impact his own convenience or preferences. The trip had ended with the group making tentative plans for winter activities, acknowledging that Elena's departure would change the dynamics, but not prevent them from continuing to explore outdoor opportunities together. Marcus had driven home feeling physically tired but emotionally energized, already looking forward to planning the next adventure. December arrived with the kind of persistent rain that newcomers to Portland found depressing, but that Marcus had learned to appreciate as part of the city's essential character. The forced indoor time gave him opportunities to focus on projects he'd been developing throughout the fall. His pottery had progressed to the point where he was producing functional pieces he actually used in his daily routine. His homebrewing experiments had yielded several batches of beer that friends genuinely enjoyed. His technical skills had expanded through the environmental monitoring project in ways that made him more valuable at work and more confident about future career possibilities. Most significantly, Marcus had developed a daily routine that felt both structured and flexible, providing stability without rigidity. Morning coffee and reading, focused work on projects he cared about, physical activity that challenged his body, creative pursuits that engaged different parts of his mind, social interaction with people who appreciated him without requiring him to be anyone other than who he was. The approaching holidays prompted reflection on how much his life had changed over the past year. The previous December, he'd been walking on eggshells around Sarah's unpredictable responses to his attempts at connection, spending enormous amounts of mental energy trying to anticipate and meet needs that seemed to change based on criteria he couldn't understand. Now he was simply living his life according to his own values and interests, offering friendship and support to others without requiring specific responses in return. Marcus received a holiday card from Sarah in mid-December, a simple note mentioning that she was doing well and hoped he was happy. The gesture felt appropriate, the kind of minimal contact that acknowledged their shared history without attempting to resurge old dynamics. Marcus sent a brief but genuine response wishing her well with her studies and her continued work in therapy. The exchange confirmed something Marcus had come to understand about their relationship. They hadn't been bad people who treated each other badly, but rather incompatible people who'd tried to force a connection that required too much effort to maintain. Sarah's discomfort with emotional intimacy had created an impossible situation for someone like Marcus, who naturally expressed care through attention and affection. His attempts to love her in the way that felt natural to him had triggered her defensive responses, which had in turn triggered his anxiety about being rejected for his core personality traits. Neither of them had been wrong to want what they wanted from a relationship, but what they wanted was fundamentally incompatible. Marcus needed someone who appreciated his attentiveness rather than seeing it as suffocating. Sarah needed someone who was naturally more emotionally distant, who wouldn't trigger her fears about losing autonomy in intimate relationships. Recognizing this incompatibility as a basic mismatch rather than a problem to be solved had been essential for Marcus's ability to move forward without resentment. As the year ended, Marcus found himself looking ahead with anticipation rather than anxiety. He'd learned that he could be genuinely happy as a single person, that his well-being didn't depend on being in a romantic relationship or being needed by someone else in specific ways. This knowledge was liberating in ways he was still discovering. He could pursue relationships because he wanted them rather than because he needed them. He could offer care and support freely without requiring it to be reciprocated according to his expectations. He could be alone without feeling lonely and seek company without feeling desperate. The new year brought opportunities that Marcus might not have been able to recognize or pursue while he was focused on managing the emotional complexity of an incompatible relationship. Elena's departure to Colorado had created an opening for someone to take over coordination of the environmental monitoring project, and Marcus had been offered the role. The position would involve more collaboration with university researchers, more travel to field sites, and more responsibility for project direction. It was exactly the kind of professional growth he'd been hoping for, but hadn't been able to pursue while his emotional energy was consumed by relationship drama. Marcus accepted the position without needing to consider how it might affect anyone else's plans or preferences. The freedom to make decisions based solely on his own professional interests and career goals felt almost shocking after months of unconsciously filtering every choice through concerns about how it might impact Sarah's mood or schedule or comfort level. The hiking group had also evolved in interesting directions. Tom had proposed organizing a series of more ambitious trips throughout the Pacific Northwest, potentially including some technical climbing and winter mountaineering for those interested in developing those skills. Marcus had signed up for a basic mountaineering course, curious about pushing his physical capabilities in new directions and attracted to the mental discipline that technical outdoor skills required. Most unexpectedly, Marcus had been approached by Joan from the pottery studio about teaching beginner classes. His technical background made him particularly good at explaining the scientific principles behind clay chemistry and firing processes, while his recent experience as a beginner himself helped him understand the frustrations and breakthroughs that new students experienced. Teaching turned out to be deeply satisfying in ways Marcus hadn't anticipated, offering opportunities to share knowledge while continuing to learn himself. By spring, Marcus had created a life that felt both full and sustainable. Professional work that challenged his technical skills in service of environmental causes he cared about. Physical activities that pushed his body and connected him with natural beauty. Creative pursuits that engaged different aspects of his mind. Social relationships based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than complex emotional negotiations. Solitary time that felt restorative rather than lonely. The contrast with his relationship with Sarah couldn't have been starker. Instead of expending enormous amounts of energy trying to manage someone else's discomfort with his natural way of expressing care, Marcus was simply living according to his own values and allowing relationships to develop organically around shared interests and compatible communication styles. Instead of constantly questioning whether he was too much or not enough, he was simply being himself and trusting that the right people would appreciate what he had to offer. Most importantly, Marcus had learned that being accused of neediness by someone who couldn't handle genuine connection wasn't actually a judgment about his character. Some people were uncomfortable with emotional intimacy and would label any attempt at deep connection as excessive or demanding. That was information about their capacity for relationship rather than evidence of his inadequacy as a partner. The lesson extended beyond romantic relationships to all areas of his life. Marcus had stopped moderating his enthusiasm for his interests or his willingness to offer help when he saw opportunities to be useful. He'd stopped apologizing for caring about things or for wanting to share experiences with people he enjoyed. He'd stopped treating his natural empathy and attentiveness as character flaws that needed to be managed or hidden. A year after Sarah had first accused him of being too needy, Marcus was living a life that felt genuinely aligned with his values and interests. He'd become completely self-sufficient, not because he'd learned to need less from other people, but because he'd learned to distinguish between healthy interdependence and the kind of emotional accounting that had characterized his relationship with Sarah. He could offer care and support freely because his sense of worth wasn't dependent on receiving specific responses. He could seek connection with others because he enjoyed shared experiences, rather than because he needed validation or approval. The transformation had been gradual and sometimes difficult, requiring Marcus to examine assumptions about relationships and self-worth that he'd never questioned before. But the result was a life that felt both more authentic and more sustainable than what he'd been trying to maintain while accommodating someone else's discomfort with genuine intimacy. Marcus had learned that true self-sufficiency wasn't about needing nothing from other people, but about being able to meet his own emotional needs while remaining open to connection with others who could appreciate what he had to offer. He'd discovered that the right people wouldn't see his care and attention as burdens to be managed, but as gifts to be received gratefully. And he'd realized that waiting for those people was infinitely preferable to shrinking himself to fit into someone else's limited capacity for love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.